The day Clara Dunmore rode into Redemption Creek on the back of a borrowed mule, with nothing to her name but a threadbare carpetbag, and a pair of boots so worn the left sole had separated from the upper, and flapped with every step she took. The whole town stopped what it was doing just long enough to laugh. It was the summer of 1878, deep in the heart of Texas, where the sun came down like a hammer on an anvil, and the dust never quite settled before another horse kicked it back up into the air. Redemption Creek was the kind of town that had grown fast and proud on cattle money, with a proper hotel and a general store that stocked things imported from back east, and a church with a white steeple that could be seen for 2 miles in every direction. It was not the kind of town that had patience for poverty, and it showed that patience immediately upon Clara's arrival. She slid down from the mule outside Hennessy's general store, her skirt dusty from the long road, her dark hair pinned up under a simple bonnet that had faded from blue to something closer to the color of a winter sky. She had ridden 30 miles from the town of Sutter's Bend, where the farm her father had worked for 20 years had been swallowed up by debt after his death 6 months prior. She had nowhere else to go, only a letter in her carpetbag from a woman named Edna Prout, who had placed an advertisement in a regional newspaper seeking a seamstress willing to work for room and board. Clara had answered that advertisement with everything she had left in her. The flapping of her boot sole was the first thing anyone noticed. It made a sound like a slow clap against the wooden boardwalk as she stepped up onto it, and Marable Cott, the wife of the town banker, standing outside the millinery shop with 2 of her friends, turned her head and stared at the sound before bursting into a high, artificial laugh. "Good heavens," Marable said, loud enough for the street to hear. "Would you look at that? She's wearing boots that are trying to say goodbye to her feet." Her friends laughed with her, the kind of laughter that meant to wound, and Clara felt the heat climb up the back of her neck. She did not stop walking. She had learned a long time ago, in the hard years after her mother died and before her father's health failed, that stopping to answer cruelty only fed it more. She lifted her chin and kept moving, even as she heard one of the other women say something about how the poorhouse must be running short of applicants if they were letting them wander into respectable towns. A man outside the saloon leaned against the post and grinned. A boy sitting on the steps of the barber shop elbowed another boy and pointed. Clara's face remained composed, though her hands tightened on the strap of her carpetbag until her knuckles went pale. She was 23 years old. She had buried her father in February, settled what debts she could, and sold everything in the farmhouse that would bring a fair price. She had kept only the carpetbag, the bonnet, and the boots, because a person needed boots to walk, even boots that had given up the fight. She found Edna Prout's dress shop on the far end of the main street, past the blacksmith and the feed store, where the buildings thinned out and the road turned back to dirt instead of packed stone. The sign above the door read Prout's Fine Alterations, and it was painted in neat green letters that had begun to peel at the edges. Clara knocked. Edna Prout was a small woman somewhere in her 50s, with sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles and flour on her apron that had nothing to do with baking and everything to do with the chalk she used to mark fabric. She opened the door, looked Clara up and down with the quick efficiency of a woman who had spent her life measuring things, and stepped aside to let her in. "You're Clara Dunmore," Edna said. It was not a question. "I am," Clara said. "You sew?" "Since I was 8 years old." Edna handed her a piece of calico and a needle threaded with blue cotton and pointed at a chair without another word. Clara sat down and worked a buttonhole in the fabric with steady, practiced hands. Edna watched for about 30 seconds, then nodded once. "Room is upstairs. Meals are at 6 and noon. You mend what I tell you to mend and cut what I tell you to cut, and we'll get along fine." She paused, looking down at Clara's boots with an expression that was not cruel but was certainly honest. "We'll get you some proper footwear. Can't have my seamstress walking around like that. People talk." "I know," Clara said quietly. "I walked past them talking." Edna made a sound that was not quite a laugh but was not quite sympathetic either. "This town talks a great deal," she said. "Pay it no mind. Half the people in Redemption Creek got here with less than you've got, and have spent every year since pretending otherwise." Clara tucked that thought away somewhere useful, and followed Edna up the narrow stairs to the room above the shop, which was small and clean and smelled of cedar and lavender, with a window that looked out over the rooftops toward the open range beyond the town's edge. She set her carpetbag down on the narrow bed, took off her bonnet, and sat for a moment in the quiet, letting herself breathe. She had made it. That was what mattered. She had made it to somewhere. She did not know yet that somewhere was the same town as Colt Mercer. Colt Mercer was not a man who inspired indifference. People either admired him or resented him, and sometimes both at once, which was perhaps the most honest response to a man who had built himself from almost nothing into the largest cattle operation in 3 counties. He was 30 years old, broad through the shoulders, with the kind of sun-weathered face that comes from spending every working day outdoors rather than in an office, though he had the office too, a well-furnished room in the Mercer Ranch house 8 miles east of town. His hair was dark with a tendency to curl at the ends when it needed cutting, which it usually did, because he was always too busy riding fence line or negotiating contracts with buyers from Fort Worth to remember a haircut. He was wealthy, genuinely wealthy in the way that 1,878 Texas measured wealth, which meant land and cattle and water rights, and a reputation that preceded him into every room. He drove his cattle north on the Kishom Trail every spring, sold at the Kansas railheads, and came home with enough profit to improve the ranch and still have money left over. He employed 30 cowboys and had a housekeeper and a cook, and the town of Redemption Creek had quietly decided years ago that Colt Mercer was the closest thing they had to royalty, which meant every unmarried woman of suitable age had been paraded before him at one time or another by a hopeful mother or aunt. He had not chosen any of them, not because he was indifferent to women, but because he had not yet found one who made him feel anything worth building a life around. He was honest enough with himself to know that was what he was looking for, even if he would not have said so aloud to anyone, because men in 1,878 Texas did not say things like that aloud. He came into Redemption Creek on the 3rd morning after Clara's arrival, riding a bay horse named Ranger that was 16 hands tall and moved with the easy confidence of an animal that knew its rider. He came to the bank first, as he usually did on supply runs, then to the general store, then to pick up a repaired saddle from the blacksmith. It was a routine trip, unremarkable in every way, until he turned his horse down the main street and happened to see Clara Dunmore coming out of Prute's dress shop with a length of blue fabric over one arm and a small parcel in her other hand. He noticed her because she moved differently from most people on the street. There was a carefulness to how she stepped, the deliberate placement of her feet that he recognized after a moment as the movement of someone compensating for impractical footwear. He glanced down and saw the boots, the flapping sole that she had tried to fix with a piece of cord laced around the front, which had helped somewhat but not entirely. She was walking with her chin up and her shoulders straight in the way that people walk when they know they are being looked at and refuse to flinch. He recognized that walk too. He had walked that way himself, a long time ago, before the cattle money, when he had been the boy whose father drank and whose mother took in other people's washing to keep them from starving. He had walked like that into rooms where he had no business being, lifting his chin at the people who looked at him sideways. He pulled Ranger to a stop and watched her for a moment, not with the idle curiosity of someone looking at a spectacle, but with the focused attention of a man who had just seen something unexpected and wanted to understand what it was. Clara did not notice him watching. She crossed the street toward the general store, stepped up onto the boardwalk, and the cord around her boot chose that moment to slip. The sole flapped open wide and caught on the edge of a board, and she stumbled forward, catching herself on the doorframe of the store with both hands and losing the parcel in the process. It hit the boardwalk and rolled off into the dust below. 3 women standing nearby, Marable caught among them because Marable seemed to have made it her personal mission to be wherever Clara was vulnerable, made the kind of sound that is worse than laughter because it pretends to be concern while being nothing of the sort. "Oh dear," Marable said. "Someone ought to help the poor dear find a cobbler, or perhaps just find her some boots that have not given up entirely." The laughter followed, sharp and pretty and mean. Colt was off Ranger before he had consciously decided to dismount. He wrapped the reins around the hitching post and crossed the street in about 6 strides, stepping down off the boardwalk to pick up the parcel where it had landed in the dust, then stepping back up beside Clara, who had straightened herself and was looking at the loose sole of her boot with an expression that she was working very hard to keep neutral. "Miss," he said, holding out the parcel. She looked up at him, and he found himself looking into a pair of gray eyes that were steady and clear and faintly defiant, the eyes of someone who had decided a long time ago that the world was not going to break her even if it kept trying. "Thank you," she said, and took the parcel from him. He crouched down then, right there on the boardwalk in front of half the town, which was something Colt Mercer did not do for anyone, and he examined the cord she had used to hold the sole in place. He could see immediately that the cord was too thin and the knot was pulling at an angle that would not hold. "May I?" he asked, looking up at her. She stared at him. Around them the laughter had gone completely silent. "I beg your pardon," she said. "Your boot," he said. "The cord you've used will keep slipping. I've got a piece of rawhide in my saddlebag that will hold better, if you'll let me." For a moment she just looked at him, and he could see her weighing something in her mind. He understood later that she had been deciding whether this was its own kind of mockery, a rich man kneeling in the street to make a point at her expense. He held her gaze and waited, because he could not think of anything to say that would settle that question for her faster than just waiting. "All right," she said finally. He went to Ranger's saddlebag and found the strip of rawhide he used sometimes for quick field repairs when he was out on the range. And he came back and crouched down again and worked the old cord loose and replaced it with the rawhide, tying it tight and proper at the right angle so the sole lay flat and would not catch. It took about 2 minutes. He was aware of every eye on the street being focused on him, and he ignored all of them, because the only thing that mattered in that moment was that the knot was right. When he stood up, Marable Cott was staring at him with an expression he had never seen on her face before, which was something between confusion and social embarrassment, as though she had just witnessed a piece of theater that had not followed the script she expected. "That should hold until you can get to a proper cobbler," he said to Clara. "There's one in Harlow, 2 towns over if the one here can't help." "Thank you," Clara said again, and this time her voice was a fraction warmer, the kind of warmth you give something carefully, a small piece of it at a time because you are not yet sure it deserves the whole. "Colt Mercer," he said and held out his hand. She shook it. "Clara Dunmore, I'm working for Mrs. Prout. I know Edna," he said. "She's a good woman." Something in the steadiness of her gaze made him want to stay standing on the boardwalk talking to her for longer than 2 minutes, which was unusual enough that he noticed it. But he had a saddle to collect and ranch business to attend to, so he touched the brim of his hat to her and went back to Ranger, feeling the weight of every stare on the street as he untied the reins and stepped up into the saddle. He looked back once before he rode on. She was already going through the door of the general store, her boot flat on the boardwalk, her chin up, and something about the particular straightness of her spine made him think that woman is going to be something in this town. Give her long enough. He was not wrong. He was just not yet prepared for how quickly it would happen, or for what it would mean for him. Clara settled into Edna Prute's shop with the same quiet efficiency she applied to everything. Within a week, she had reorganized the storage room so that fabric bolts were easier to access and thread was sorted by color in labeled jars. Within 2 weeks, she had taken on 3 new customers who had heard, from Edna's existing clients, that the new seamstress had an eye for fit that Edna herself admired. Within a month, she was a recognizable face on Redemption Creek's Main Street, and the mocking had faded, not disappeared entirely, because Marable Cott was not a woman who abandoned a position once she had taken it, but faded to the muttered kind rather than the public kind. Edna had found her a pair of second-hand boots at the general store, sturdy brown leather ones that fit well enough with an extra layer of stocking, and Clara wore them every day with the same matter-of-fact acceptance with which she wore everything else in her life. She also, quietly and without telling anyone, worked on her old worn boots in the evenings. She had asked the blacksmith, a man named Porter who had a weathered face and kind eyes, if she could borrow some leather tools, and he had said yes without asking why, which she appreciated. She took the sole off entirely and reattached it with proper stitching. She punched through the leather herself and reinforced the heel and worked oil into the leather until it was supple again. When she was finished, they were not new boots, but they were sound, and she put them away in the bottom of her carpetbag as a reminder that the things people discard are often worth saving. She thought about Colt Mercer more than she meant to. She thought about the way he had crouched down in front of the whole street without a flicker of self-consciousness, the way he had focused entirely on the knot, and the angle of the rawhide as though there were nothing more important in the world. She thought about his hands, which were a working man's hands despite his wealth, rough and capable, not the hands of a man who had let his fortune make him soft. She also thought practically that he was the wealthiest man in the county, and she was a woman living on room and board above a dress shop, and that those two things rarely led anywhere worth hoping for. She was a practical woman. She had learned to be. She did not expect to see him again so soon. But Redemption Creek was not a large town, and Colt Mercer had more reasons to come into it than she had realized, and 9 days after the incident on the boardwalk, she looked up from the bolt of green silk she was pinning at Edna's work table and found him standing in the doorway of the shop, hat in hand. "Mr. Mercer," Edna said from across the room, pleased in the way she was pleased when a good bolt of fabric arrived. "What can we do for you?" "I need something made for my sister," he said. "She's coming to visit in 3 weeks, and she's written ahead asking for a proper dress for the church social." He glanced at Clara. "Edna, your advertisement said you could do full construction from pattern, not just alterations." "Clara handles the construction work," Edna said, with the proud efficiency of a woman claiming credit for a good decision she had made. "She's the better hand for it." He looked at Clara. She looked at him. "I'll need measurements," Clara said. "Does your sister have a dressmaker back home who might have them?" "She's in San Antonio." "Can write to her." "If you write, ask her to send the measurements from her most recent fitted dress and the name of the fabric she prefers. It saves us time." Clara set down the bolt of silk. "What is the occasion exactly, and what is the social atmosphere in your household? That tells me the level of formality." He blinked slightly, as though he had expected something different from her. "The church social is fairly formal. My sister is 27. She likes things that are elegant but not fussy." "Can work with that," Clara said. "Send the measurements when you have them. I'll need at least a week once I have everything I need." "Of course," he said, and then instead of leaving he stood in the doorway for another moment. "How is the boot holding up?" She felt heat come into her face, which annoyed her and kept her expression even. "Your rawhide held better than the cord," she said. "I've since had them properly repaired." "Good," he said, and the word came out with a warmth that seemed to catch even him by surprise, because he put his hat back on quickly and said goodbye to Edna and left. Edna waited approximately 4 seconds after the door closed before turning to look at Clara with the expression of a woman who had lived long enough to know exactly what she had just witnessed. "Don't," Clara said. "I haven't said a word," Edna said, and turned back to her work. The measurements arrived from San Antonio 12 days later, along with a letter from Colt's sister, whose name was Anna Mercer, full of enthusiastic descriptions of the color green and a firm opinion against excessive ruffles, which made Clara like her immediately without having met her. She chose a deep sage green from the shop's best stock and began drafting the pattern, and she was deep in the work of fitting the bodice pieces when Colt came in again, not for the dress, but to ask whether the measurements had arrived. It was, she realized later, a question he could have sent a ranch hand to ask. He did not need to come himself. She filed that observation away without attaching any particular interpretation to it, because she was a practical woman. But she was also a woman, and she noticed that when he talked to her the way people talk when they are genuinely interested in the answers, not filling silence but actually listening. He asked her about the ranch business when he discovered she understood something about livestock management from her years on her father's farm. He told her about the Kishom Trail drives, the long miles north through Indian Territory and into Kansas, the particular sound of 3,000 cattle moving together at dusk. He talked about his foreman, a man named Hector Sandoval who had ridden with him since the first drive and whom he trusted with his life. He talked about the land itself with a reverence that she recognized because she had felt it herself once, before the land was taken from her family. She told him about her father. She had not meant to, but he asked where she had come from in the way that meant he actually wanted to know. And so she told him about the farm in Sutter's Bend and the debt and the long, slow year of her father's illness, and the 6 months since his death that had been the hardest of her life. And he listened without filling her silences with easy comfort, which was exactly right. "I'm sorry," he said, when she had finished. "Losing land you've worked is its own kind of grief. You sound like you know that," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "My family lost our first ranch," he said. "I was 14. We started over with nothing." He looked out the window of the shop. "I swore I'd never let it happen again. Spent 15 years making sure of it." She looked at him, this man the town treated like a king, and understood something new about him that made him considerably more interesting and also considerably more comprehensible. "Is that why you work the way you do?" she asked. "The drives, the land purchases. Everyone says you work harder than any of your hands." "I work the way I work because I like it," he said, which was also true, she could tell. "The fear drove me at first, but the land is what keeps me going now. The cattle, the open range, wouldn't trade it." She smiled before she could stop herself, and something in his expression shifted when she did. Something that made her look away at the sage green fabric on her workbench and focus very deliberately on it. He left when Edna called Clara through to the fitting room for a customer, and Clara spent the rest of the afternoon with her hands busy and her mind doing things she told it firmly not to do. Anna Mercer arrived 3 weeks after Colt's first visit, on the afternoon stage from San Antonio, and she was everything her letter had suggested. Warm, opinionated, 27 years old, with dark hair like her brother's and a laugh that came quickly and meant it. She came straight to the dress shop before she even went to her brother's ranch, which delighted Edna and amused Clara, and the fitting went beautifully because the measurements had been accurate and Clara's pattern was precise. "Oh, this is exactly right," Anna said, turning in front of the long mirror Edna kept propped against the wall. The sage green settled against her skin perfectly, the bodice fitted without being tight, the skirt full enough for dancing without excess. "How did you know I hate excess ruffles?" "You said so in your letter," Clara said, kneeling to pin the hem level. Anna looked down at her with the particular attention of someone who has just clocked something worth knowing. "Colt said you were remarkable," she said. Clara kept her eyes on the hem. I expect he said I was competent. He said both things, Anna said cheerfully. He mentioned you 3 times in his last 2 letters, which for Colt is practically a declaration. Anna, Clara said, and her voice came out steadier than she felt. I'm only making an observation, Anna said, entirely unrepentant. Clara finished pinning the hem and stood up. The dress will be ready the day before the social, she said. I'll press it the morning of if you want to bring it back. I want to talk to you more, Anna said. Will you come to dinner at the ranch? Clara looked at her. I don't think that would be appropriate. Why not? Because you work in a dress shop. Because your brother is, she stopped. Because my brother is what? Anna asked, and her voice had gotten quieter, more serious. Wealthy, Clara, my brother is a man who spent his childhood sleeping in a wagon while my parents tried to find work. He doesn't care about that kind of thing, and neither do I. Clara thought about the boardwalk, about him crouching in the dust in front of half the town, focused entirely on the knot. I'll think about it, she said. She went. She told herself she went because Anna had asked, and it would have been rude to refuse twice. But she knew she went because she wanted to see the ranch, and because some quiet part of her that she had been steadfastly ignoring wanted to see Colt Mercer in the place he loved. The Mercer Ranch was 8 miles east of town on land that rose gently toward a line of low hills, and the house was large and solid, built of limestone with a wide veranda and windows that caught the evening light. Around it the outbuildings spread in an orderly way, the barn and bunkhouse and cookhouse and corrals, all of it speaking of an operation run with thought and care. The cattle grazed in the distance, dark shapes against the golden grass, and the smell of the place was horses and hay and wood smoke, and something clean that Clara thought must simply be the smell of land well tended. Colt came out to the yard when he heard the wagon, and something happened in his face when he saw her that he did not manage to hide fast enough, a sudden lighting up that was gone in an instant behind the composed expression he usually wore. But Clara had been watching faces her whole life, the way a seamstress watches the lines of a body, and she saw it. She felt an answering thing in her own chest and said nothing about it to anyone. Dinner was at a long table in the kitchen rather than a formal dining room, which she had not expected. Hector Sandoval ate with them, and the cook, a Mexican woman named Rosa who had worked for Colt since the beginning and treated him with the affectionate exasperation of someone who has watched a person grow up and reserves the right to say so, and Anna, and Clara. The food was good, and the conversation was easy and loud and full of argument about a cattle breeding decision Hector thought was sensible, and Anna thought was ridiculous, and Colt was trying to defend with logic, while Rosa interjected from the kitchen doorway with opinions that suggested she had been listening to all of it for years. Clara found herself laughing, genuinely laughing, for the first time since before her father got sick. After dinner, when Anna and Hector were talking in the kitchen and Rosa was washing dishes and refusing help from everyone, Colt walked out onto the veranda, and after a moment Clara followed him. The sky was enormous out here, away from the town's lights, thick with stars in a way that made the air feel full instead of empty. Your sister is wonderful, Clara said. She is, he agreed. She's also been managing me since I was 20, he said. She has opinions about everything. She has good opinions, Clara said. She told me she invited you, he said. Hoped you'd come. She looked at the stars rather than at him. Why? Because I've been wanting to talk to you again since the last time I was in Edna's shop, he said simply, without any of the maneuvering she might have expected from a man in his position. And because I think you would have liked the ranch. I do like it, she said. Clara. He said her name the way he said everything, directly, without ornament. She made herself look at him. He was watching her with the same focused attention he had given to the knot on her boot, and it was the most unnerving and also the most steadying thing she had ever experienced. I don't know what your intentions are, she said, and I'm not a woman who has the luxury of being confused about things like that, So if you're going to say something, please say it plainly." He was quiet for a moment, and she appreciated that he took the moment rather than filling it with words. "I would like to court you properly," he said, "with your permission. If you have any interest in that." She breathed in the night air, the grass and horses and stars. She thought about being practical. She thought about her worn boots and the laughter on the main street and the 6 months she had spent being ground down by grief and poverty and the indifference of the world. And she thought about how this man had crouched in the dust and tied a knot with the same care he would have given to anything worth doing right. "Have an interest in that," she said. He smiled, and it transformed his face in a way that made her understand immediately why Anna found him worth managing and why half the county respected him, and why she herself was going to have a great deal of trouble being practical about any of this. The courtship of Colt Mercer and Clara Dunmore was the talk of Redemption Creek for the rest of that summer and well into the fall, which was exactly what both of them expected and neither of them cared about. He came to the dress shop on his town trips with greater frequency than before, and sometimes he brought small things, not extravagant gifts, because he understood somehow without being told that she would not have welcomed extravagance but useful things. A length of good leather for bookwork, a jar of particularly good honey from a man he bought supplies from, a copy of a novel by Charles Dickens that he had found in the bookshop in the next town and thought she would like. She did like it. She read it in the evenings by lamplight and reported back to him the following week with the strong opinions she had developed about the characters, and he listened and argued back when he disagreed, which was often enough to make the conversations interesting. He took her riding on Sunday afternoons when the shop was closed, lending her a gentle mare named Clover who was steady and good-tempered, and they rode out into the hill country east of town, where the land opened up in ways that made Clara understand viscerally why he loved it. He showed her the water sources on his property, the spring-fed creek that gave him security in dry years, the sections of fence line he was expanding, the pasture land he had acquired the previous year from a neighbor who was moving back east. He talked about all of it with the knowledgeable love of a man who has built something piece by piece and knows exactly how each piece fits. She told him more about her father's farm, the good years when the crops had come in, and her father had been healthy, and the land had felt like something that would always be there. He listened with the same quality of attention he brought to everything, and she began to understand that it was not a performance of interest. It was simply how he was, a man who, when he gave his attention, gave all of it. There were hard moments. Marable Cott, whose displeasure at the boardwalk incident had never fully dissipated, made it known to several people that she thought it was inappropriate for a man of Colt's standing to be publicly courting a woman of Clara's position, and this opinion circulated in the way that opinions in small towns do, gaining elaboration with each repetition. Clara heard some version of it third-hand and brought it to Edna, who listened and then said, "Marable Cott's husband had nothing 10 years ago, and she pretends she doesn't remember it. Don't give her the satisfaction of caring." Colt heard a more direct version of it when Marable's husband, Gerald Cott, brought it up in the bank with what he probably thought was friendly concern and what was actually a social warning. And Colt looked at him for a long moment and said, "Gerald, you might want to spend more time on your own affairs and less on mine," and walked out of the bank. And that was the last time anyone said anything to him directly about it. But there was also a harder moment, one that had nothing to do with Marable Cott and everything to do with the truth of who Clara was and what she was afraid of. It came in October, when the evenings had turned cool and the light had changed to the amber quality of early fall. They were sitting on the veranda of the ranch house after an evening meal that Rosa had cooked with the particular indulgence she reserved for occasions she privately approved of, and Anna had gone back to San Antonio 2 weeks prior, and it was just the two of them in the quiet of the ranch at evening, and Colt was talking about the spring drive and his plans for expanding the herd, And Clara was listening and also watching his hands where they rested on the railing of the veranda. And she said something she had not fully planned to say. "What happens," she said, "if the cattle market turns? If there's a bad year, what happens to all of this?" He looked at her, hearing the real question underneath the practical one. "I have enough water rights and land diversification that one bad year doesn't break us," he said carefully. "I've planned for it. My father planned too," she said. "For 15 years he worked that land and planned." "I know," he said. "And I'm sorry that happened. I'm not going to tell you it couldn't happen here because I don't know what the next 20 years look like for the cattle industry, and I won't lie to you about it." He paused. "But I can tell you I have spent every year since I was 21 building something that can withstand a great deal. And that I'm not interested in asking you to depend on something I haven't thought through." She was quiet. "Is that what you're afraid of?" he asked. "Depending on something that disappears." She thought about it honestly, in the way she tried to think about hard things. "I spent 6 months after my father died with nothing to rely on but myself," she said. "And I managed. But I was terrified the whole time, and I don't want to be terrified again by something I chose." "You don't have to choose anything," he said quietly. "You can keep working for Edna. You can have your own money and your own work. I'm not asking you to give up what you've built." He looked at her steadily. "I'm asking to be something alongside it, not instead of it." She looked at him for a long time in the evening light, this man who had crouched in the dust of the main street and retied her boot because it needed doing, who talked about his land the way she talked about fabric because both of them loved the thing they worked with, who had listened to every word she said and remembered it. "Colt," she said. "Clara, I think I've been falling in love with you since the second time you came into the shop," she said, "and I've been trying not to because I'm a practical woman." "I know," he said, and there was warmth and also amusement in it. "I noticed you trying." "I expect everyone noticed," she said dryly. "Edna noticed immediately," he confirmed. She laughed, and he reached across the railing and took her hand, and she let him. And they sat in the October evening with the sound of cattle in the far distance and the smell of the range in the cooling air. And Clara thought, "This is something I can trust, not because the world is safe, because it is not, but because this man is honest, and honest is the most reliable thing there is." He proposed in November. Not at a formal dinner or with an audience or with any of the elaborate stage management that such things sometimes involved in the town she had heard about back east. He proposed in Edna's shop, on a Tuesday morning when the light was coming in pale through the front windows, and Clara was at the work table with a length of dark red wool and a pair of shears, and he came in and stood on the customer's side of the table and said, "I've been thinking about what you said on the veranda." "Which part?" she said, not looking up from her measuring. "The part where you said you were falling in love with me," he said. She set down the shears and looked at him. "Because I've been in love with you since you told me off for being vague in my intentions," he said. "I've been in love with you since you stood on that boardwalk with your chin up and didn't give anyone the satisfaction of showing what it cost you." He reached into his coat pocket and put a ring on the work table between them. It was a simple thing, a gold band with a small garnet, not showy, exactly right. "I would like you to marry me, Clara Dunmore, if you're willing." She looked at the ring. She looked at him. "Yes," she said, "I'm willing." He came around the work table and kissed her for the first time, which was warm and certain and exactly as it should be. And Edna chose that moment to come through the door from the back room and made a sound of deep satisfaction at what she walked into, and then went back through the door and left them alone, which was exactly what Clara would have wanted. They married in December 1878, in the white-steepled church that could be seen from 2 miles in every direction. The ceremony was on a clear, cold day that turned the light to winter gold, and Clara wore a dress she had made herself, ivory wool with a fitted bodice and simple, elegant lines, because she was the only seamstress she trusted for something this important. She wore the boots she had repaired herself, the ones from the carpetbag, because she had finished them beautifully and they were sound and they were hers, and she thought her father would have liked that. Anna Mercer was there, having come back from San Antonio the moment she received Colt's letter, and she embraced Clara with the warmth of someone who has been a sister much longer than the paperwork shows. Edna Prout sat in the third pew and cried the kind of happy tears she would have denied if anyone had mentioned them afterward. Hector Sandoval stood up with Colt and clapped him on the shoulder after the vows, with the deep approval of a man who has watched someone he respects finally make a decision the world makes sense with. Maribel Cott was also there, because it was a church social and she would not have missed it, and she sat in the back and watched Clara Dunmore walk down the aisle with her chin up in the dress she had made herself and the repaired boots on her feet, and something in her expression, Clara noticed from the corner of her eye as she passed, was not contempt anymore. It was something closer to reconsideration. Clara did not stop to address it. She had a man at the end of the aisle who was looking at her like she was the most remarkable thing in the room, and she was not going to keep him waiting. The ranch in the first months of their marriage was a revelation. Clara had thought she understood the life her husband led, from the Sunday rides and the conversations over dinner, but living inside it was different. The mornings started early and ended in long evenings of lamplight, and the pace of the place was set by the land and the cattle and the weather, not by anything a person decided. She found she did not mind this at all, because it was not unlike the rhythm of the farm where she had grown up, the deep cadence of a life organized around living things. She kept her work. She had been clear about that, and Colt had been equally clear that he supported it, and she continued to go into town 3 days a week to work with Edna, whose arthritis was worsening and whose gratitude for Clara's increased role in the business she expressed in typical Edna fashion, which was by teaching her every technical skill she had accumulated over 40 years of dressmaking, without once acknowledging how valuable the teaching was. Clara received it all in the same spirit and quietly began to learn the business side as well, because she had grown up watching her father manage a farm, and she understood intuitively that a business was a living thing that needed tending. She and Colt talked about everything. That was what surprised her most in the early months, the quality of conversation in a marriage to a man who was genuinely interested in her thinking. He asked her opinion about the ranch decisions, not as a courtesy, but because he had discovered quickly that she had a level head and an understanding of risk that was practical and useful, sharpened by years of operating with very little margin for error. She talked to him about the dress shop business, the pattern she was seeing in what customers wanted, the possibility that there was demand for a wider range of fabrics if the stock was right. He listened and asked questions that were actually helpful. They disagreed sometimes. About money, about the pace of expansion, about whether a particular decision was worth the risk. They disagreed the way two people disagree when they respect each other's thinking, directly and sometimes heatedly, and then resolved, and neither of them had learned the bad habit of fighting to win rather than fighting toward the truth. The spring of 1879 brought the cattle drive, and Clara rode out with Colt to the edge of the property to watch the herd move north, 3,000 head of longhorns in a great flowing river of brown and tan, with Hector at the point, and the cowboys riding flanks and drag in the choking dust. And the sound of it was like nothing she had ever heard before, low and constant and overwhelming. She understood in that moment, watching Colt's face as he watched the drive begin, what this work meant to him at a level beyond profit or security. It was a love affair with the land and the cattle and the whole great enterprise of it, and she felt the beauty of it herself like a hand on her chest. "Come home safe," she told him, because he would ride with the drive for the first week before turning back to manage the ranch in his absence. "I always do," he said, and kissed her in the early morning light with the smell of cattle dust around them, and rode away. He came back on the 8th day, as planned, and the drive went north under Hector's capable management, and came back in late July with the profit that would pay the year's wages and expand the herd for next spring, and everything went exactly as planned. Everything except the thing that Colt mentioned to Clara one evening in early June, when she came to him in the kitchen after Rosa had gone to bed and found him sitting at the table with a letter and an expression she had not seen before. "What is it?" she asked. He looked up. "Man named Prescott," he said. "He's been buying up water rights along the Eastern Creek bed, the small ranchers who don't know what they've got." She sat down across from him. "The creek that runs through your lower pasture." "Not quite," he said, "but it feeds into the aquifer that feeds the spring on my eastern section. If he controls enough of the creek rights, he can affect the flow." He set the letter down. "He's been at this for 2 years. Just found out tonight from a neighbor who sold to him 6 months ago without understanding what he was selling." "What can you do about it?" she asked. "Can buy the remaining parcels that haven't sold yet," he said. "It's more money than I plan to spend this year." "It means slowing the herd expansion." "Then slow the herd expansion," she said immediately. He looked at her. "The water is what everything depends on," she said. "You told me that yourself the first time you showed me the eastern section. Without the spring you lose the summer grazing. Without the summer grazing you lose a third of your carrying capacity. A year of slower expansion costs you growth. Losing the water costs you the ranch." He was quiet, watching her. "You know this already," she said. "You're telling me about it because you're deciding and you want to think it through out loud." "Yes," he said, and then, after a moment, "also because it's your ranch too, and a decision this size shouldn't be mine alone." She reached across the table and put her hand over his. "Buy the parcels," she said. He bought them. It took most of the year's surplus and required a loan from the bank against future drives, which he negotiated carefully and repaid the following year when the drive came back strong. Prescott, who had apparently expected the smaller ranchers to be the only buyers in the game, made one inquiry about whether Colt would sell his newly acquired parcels back at a profit, and Colt declined with the same flat politeness he applied to all things he had already decided, and Prescott moved his operations elsewhere. By the fall of 1879, the water rights were secured, the loan was paid, and the ranch was sound. That fall, Clara learned she was pregnant. She told Colt in the kitchen on a Sunday morning, with Rosa conspicuously absent because Rosa had known for 3 days and had been physically incapable of being neutral about it. And Colt's face did the thing it had done on the day of their first dinner, that sudden unguarded lighting up that he could not entirely control. And he crossed the kitchen in 2 strides and held her with the careful, enormous tenderness of a man who understands that the world has just changed and wants to be worthy of it. "Are you all right?" he asked. "Are you well?" "I'm perfectly well," she said into his shoulder. "I'm also terrified." "So am I," he said honestly, which was exactly the right thing to say. The pregnancy was straightforward and healthy, attended by the town's doctor, a methodical man named Haskell who had been practicing medicine in Redemption Creek for 15 years, and who Clara trusted because he answered her questions directly rather than dismissing them. She kept working at the shop until the 7th month, when Edna firmly told her to rest, and she kept her hand in the business side from home, working over the accounts and the correspondence and the pattern orders that Edna sent out to other towns. In March 1880, their son was born. They named him Thomas James Mercer, Thomas for Clara's father and James for Colt's grandfather, and he came into the world with a pair of lungs that announced themselves impressively and a head of dark hair that was clearly going to stay. Rosa wept freely and made no effort to pretend otherwise. Edna came to the ranch the following day and brought a blanket she had knit herself, which she presented with the brisk manner of someone doing a practical thing, while her eyes were very bright. Anna sent a letter that was so enthusiastic it took up 4 pages. Hector Sandoval came to the kitchen door on the first evening. hat in hand, and said he had heard it was a boy and that he wanted to say congratulations. And Colt brought him in and poured him whiskey, and they sat in the kitchen until late in the evening. And Clara could hear them talking quietly from the bedroom where she rested with Thomas on her chest. And the sound of those voices, the deep, comfortable voices of men who trust each other, filled the house in a way that felt like warmth. The year 1880 was a good one. Thomas grew with the focused intensity of a healthy baby, rolling to sitting, and then to standing ahead of any of the timelines Dr. Haskell mentioned with approval. Colt took to fatherhood with the same quality of attention he brought to everything he cared about, wholly and without reservation. He was the kind of father who came in from the range at the end of the day and went directly to wherever Thomas was and spoke to him at length about whatever had happened, as though the information were urgently needed. Clara watched this and loved him more than she had thought possible, which continued to surprise her. The way love, when it is the right kind, keeps doing that, keeps expanding past the point where you thought you had measured its edges. She went back to Edna's shop in the fall with Thomas, because it turned out Edna had developed an attachment to the baby that she expressed through the medium of supervision and high-quality childcare while Clara worked. The arrangement functioned beautifully. Edna's arthritis made it harder for her to do the fine handwork, but her eye for fit and her knowledge of construction were undiminished, and Clara's hands compensated for what Edna's could no longer do, and together they were better than either had been separately. In 1881, the business grew beyond what the back of Prout's shop could contain, and Clara and Edna had a long conversation about what that meant. Edna was 63 by then, and honest about the fact that her energy was not what it had been, and Clara made a proposal that surprised them both in its clarity. She would buy a half share of the business, not as a gift from Colt's money, though she was honest about where the funds would come from, but as a proper business transaction, with papers drawn up by the lawyer in town. Edna looked at her over the wire-rimmed spectacles for a long time. "You've been planning this," she said. "Since the second month I worked here," Clara said. Edna laughed, the real laugh that Clara had learned to value because it was not given often. "All right," she said. "We'll talk to the lawyer." The business became Prout and Mercer Fine Dressmaking. The sign went up on a clear October day in 1881, fresh black letters on a clean white ground, and Clara stood on the boardwalk and looked at it with Colt beside her and Thomas on his hip, and she felt the particular satisfaction of a thing she had built herself, which was different from and as important as all the things she had built alongside someone else. "Your father would have been proud," Colt said quietly. She put her arm through his. "He would have liked you," she said. "He appreciated straightforward men." "High praise from his daughter," Colt said, and she laughed and leaned her head against his arm briefly before taking Thomas back, because the boy was clearly deciding whether the sign was something he could reach from his father's shoulder, and the answer was not a risk anyone was willing to take. Marable Cott came into the shop 2 weeks after the new sign went up. She came in the middle of the morning when Edna was in the back and Clara was at the counter reviewing a fabric order, and she stood for a moment inside the door as though orienting herself to the new proportions of the place before coming to the counter. "Mrs. Mercer," she said. Clara looked at her steadily. "Mrs. Cott." "Can I help you?" Marable was quiet for a moment in the particular way of a woman who has rehearsed something and is now finding the rehearsed version does not fit the room. "I wanted to commission a dress," she said finally, "for Christmas." "Of course," Clara said and reached for the order book. And Marable said and stopped. "And to say that I behaved poorly when you arrived in town." She said it quickly and precisely, like a woman who has made a decision and is executing it before she can change her mind. "The day you arrived was unkind, and it was unworthy of me." Clara set down her pen and looked at the woman. She thought about the boardwalk. The laughter and the flapping sole and the cord and the particular quality of humiliation, that comes from being reduced to a spectacle at your most vulnerable. She thought about the way Colt had crouched in the dust without a flicker of self-consciousness. "Thank you for saying so," Clara said. And she meant it without warmth and also without coldness, as a simple, honest acknowledgement. "Now, tell me about the dress." Marable told her about the dress. It was for a Christmas dinner at the Cott house, blue because Marable had always worn blue, full-skirted because the occasion warranted it. Clara took the order and made the dress, and it fit Marable perfectly, because Clara did not allow personal history to affect the quality of her work. Marable came back 3 more times that year, and eventually became one of the shop's most reliable clients, which was a strange and entirely real outcome that Clara noted and filed away as evidence that people are more complicated than their worst moments. The years move the way years do when a life is good, which is to say faster than expected and richer than you can fully account for while you are living in them. In 1883, their daughter arrived, and they named her Frances, after nobody in particular except that Clara had always liked the name, and Colt had agreed immediately, which was either very decisive or very agreeable of him, and she had decided it was both. Frances had Clara's gray eyes and Colt's dark hair, and an expression of interested authority that she wore from approximately 3 weeks old. And Thomas, who was 3 and had been uncertain about the whole enterprise up until the moment he saw her, decided she was primarily interesting and appointed himself her guide to everything, which she tolerated with the patient attention of someone who is waiting to run the operation herself. The ranch expanded steadily. Colt bought 2 additional sections of land in 1882 and another in 1884, increasing the carrying capacity and diversifying into horses, which were in strong demand as the settled regions of Texas grew and the railroad networks expanded. He brought Hector Sandoval in as a full partner in the horse operation, a recognition of 15 years of loyalty and skill that Hector accepted with the composed dignity of a man who knew his worth and was glad to finally see it formalized. Hector Sandoval was a Mexican man who had come north through San Antonio in the early years of the cattle drives, and he was one of the finest horsemen in the county, a fact that had not always been acknowledged openly in a time and place where Mexican vaqueros did much of the actual work of the cattle industry, while often receiving neither the credit nor the compensation they were owed. Colt had paid Hector fairly since the first drive and spoken of him accurately to buyers and other ranchers, which was a straightforward thing that Hector did not sentimentalize, but that had built the particular quality of loyalty between them that made a partnership the natural outcome. Clara had her own relationship with Hector, built over the years of shared meals and conversations about the ranch and his precise observations about everything from cattle markets to human nature. She respected him without qualification, and his wife Lucia, who moved to the ranch in 1882 when they formalized the partnership, became one of the people Clara trusted most in the world. Lucia and Clara spent many evenings together in the years that followed, talking in the kitchen while their children played in the next room. Thomas and Hector's son Marco building elaborate constructions from whatever materials were available, and occasionally knocking them over with the creative destruction that small boys apply to everything. Frances observed these operations from a position of deliberate non-participation until she was old enough to direct them, which she began doing at approximately age 2. In 1886, Clara was pregnant again, and this time it was harder. The pregnancy was more difficult than the first 2, with a persistent nausea that lasted well into the 4th month and a tiredness that sat in her bones rather than her body. Dr. Haskell was thorough and careful, and Lucia was at the ranch almost every day during the hard months, and Colt rearranged his schedule without being asked, which she noticed and did not thank him for directly because she knew it would embarrass him, but she remembered it in the accumulating record she kept of who he was. Their second son arrived in January 1887, healthy and loud and enormous, 10 pounds of absolute insistence on existing, and they named him Robert, after no one at all except that it had come to them together one evening, and they had both said it at the same moment and laughed, and that had been enough reason. Robert was from his first days a different kind of baby than either Thomas or Francis, sunnier and more immediately delighted by everything, a disposition he maintained as he grew, and that made him, in Clara's private estimation, dangerously charming and potentially a problem when he was older. Edna Prout died in the winter of 1887, peacefully and in her own bed, at the age of 69, with the satisfied expression of someone who had finished most of what they set out to do. Clara sat with her in the last weeks when the illness made clear it was not turning back, and they talked about everything and nothing, about fabric and fit and the particular satisfaction of a hem done right, and about the town and the years and the customers who had come through the door of the shop, and about Clara herself, which Edna addressed with characteristic directness. "You were the best thing that walked through that door," Edna said, on one of the last coherent evenings. "I walked through it with a boot held together with a piece of cord," Clara said. "Exactly," Edna said, and closed her eyes and was smiling. The shop became Clara's fully properly, with all the papers in order, and she renamed it Mercer's Fine Dressmaking, not because she felt the need to remove Edna's name, but because Edna had told her firmly in the last months to make it her own, and not keep someone else's name on it out of sentiment. She hired 2 young women from the town, sisters named Polly and Beth Hargrove, whose family had come from Oklahoma the previous year, and she trained them with the same quality of attention Edna had trained her, thoroughly and without condescension. The town of Redemption Creek had changed considerably by the late 1880s. The railroad came through in 1885, a branch line that connected the town to the main Galveston, Harrisburg, and San Antonio Railway, and with the railroad came growth, more businesses and more people, and a different kind of commerce that was faster and louder than the cattle pace the town had been built on. Clara watched this transformation with the careful attention of someone trying to understand what it meant for the shop, which it meant a wider customer base, and the possibility of ordering finer materials from Eastern suppliers with shorter turnaround times, both of which she made use of immediately. Colt watched the railroad's effect on the cattle trade with the same attention, and his assessment was that it changed the economics of the long drive in ways that would be significant within a decade. The drives to Kansas railheads were already declining as more Texas towns got their own rail connections, and the future of cattle operations was going to be about efficiency and proximity, rather than the epic northward migrations that had defined the industry in the 1870s and early 80s. He adapted accordingly, which was a word that described Colt's general approach to the world, and which Clara had come to understand as one of his foundational qualities. By 1888, the Mercer Ranch was loading cattle directly onto the Redemption Creek rail line for shipment to Fort Worth and San Antonio, and Hector's horse operation was supplying animals to buyers in 3 states, and the whole operation was larger and more complex than anything Colt had originally designed, and he managed all of it with the same organized efficiency and personal commitment that he had always brought to it, except now there were more people depending on it, and he took that weight seriously in a way that Clara saw in the quality of his attention on the mornings when he rode out to the range. Thomas was 8 years old in 1888, and he followed his father everywhere that he was allowed to go, which was most places, and he could already ride well and understood more about cattle management than many adults Clara knew. Frances was 5 and had opinions about everything, which she expressed with the kind of clear-eyed certainty that does not welcome argument. And Robert, at 18 months, was still primarily occupied with the business of becoming vertical and remaining there, a project he pursued with enormous enthusiasm and frequent failure. On a Sunday afternoon in the early fall of 1888, Clara was sitting on the veranda of the ranch house with mending in her lap, which she still did her own, because she enjoyed the particular quality of that kind of work, and Colt came and sat beside her in the way he had sat beside her. For 10 years of Sunday afternoons, and the light was the same amber October light, it had been on the evening he said he wanted to court her. And she thought about that suddenly, the whole distance from there to here, the worn boots and the borrowed mule and the 30 miles of road and the carpetbag. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, because he had learned over 10 years to read the quality of her silences. "The day I arrived in this town," she said. He was quiet, letting her continue if she wanted to. "I was so afraid," she said, "not of being laughed at. That was awful, but I had managed it before. I was afraid of what came after, that there would be nothing, that I had ridden 30 miles and there would just be nothing." "There was Edna," he said. "There was Edna," she agreed. "And then there was you in the street with a piece of rawhide." He smiled, the particular quiet smile that still did things to her chest after 10 years. "A very important piece of rawhide," he said. "The most important," she agreed seriously. He reached over and took her hand, the way he had on the October evening when she first let him, and she let him now as she had then, except that now it felt like coming home rather than like a risk, which was perhaps the difference between the beginning of love and the settling of it into something permanent. "Are you happy?" he asked. He asked this sometimes directly, without ceremony, because he was a man who preferred to know things accurately rather than assume them. She looked at the ranch, the corrals and the barn and the long reach of the land east toward the hills, and she thought about the shop with its new sign and the fabric orders from San Antonio, and she thought about Thomas with his father's quality of attention and Frances with her own quality of certainty and Robert's enormous sunny confidence in the universe. And she thought about 10 years of Sunday afternoons and mornings in the kitchen and evenings, on the veranda, and conversations about everything, and arguments about money, and the particular quality of waking up next to someone you trust entirely. "I am deeply happy," she said. "It still surprises me sometimes." "Why?" he asked. "Because I arrived here with nothing," she said, "and happiness felt like something that happened to other people." He squeezed her hand. "You didn't arrive with nothing," he said. "You arrived with your hands and your eyes and that particular way you hold your chin when someone is trying to make you feel small. That's more than nothing." She looked at him. "That's quite philosophical for a cattle rancher," she said. "I've had good influences," he said. She laughed, and Frances, who had appeared in the doorway behind them with a serious expression and a question about whether supper was going to be soon because she had opinions about this, looked between them and said, "Why are you laughing?" With the dissatisfied curiosity of a 5-year-old who has walked into a joke she was not part of. "Your father said something funny," Clara said. Frances turned her gaze to Colt. "What did you say?" "I said your mother is remarkable," Colt said. Frances considered this. "I know," she said, with the placid confidence of a child who has simply always understood this to be true, and went back inside. Clara and Colt looked at each other over the mending and the empty afternoon, and the laughter was the easy kind that comes out of happiness rather than humor, and the evening came on slow and golden around them, the way evenings do in the hill country of Texas in the fall, when the light goes amber and the grass goes gold and the distance looks like something out of a painting, and the whole of it, the land and the light and the man beside her, felt to Clara like the answer to the question she had not known she was asking, when she climbed down from a borrowed mule in front of a general store with a flapping boot sole and a carpetbag full of the only things she had left. The years that followed were good ones, full and busy and rooted in the deep way that a life is rooted when it is built on things that are real. Thomas grew into a serious, competent young man who was riding with the ranch hands by the time he was 12, and showing the particular combination of his father's decisiveness and his mother's analytical eye that made him good at managing moving parts. Frances grew into someone who knew her own mind at an age when most people were still working out what their mind was, which was sometimes challenging and mostly wonderful. And she developed an interest in the business side of things that she exercised on anyone who would let her, which eventually included Clara in the shop and Hector in the horse operation, both of whom found her useful in spite of themselves. Robert grew up sunny and large and genuinely interested in people in a way that was different from anyone else in his family, an extroversion that delighted him and slightly bewildered his more internally focused parents, and which manifested early in the form of friendships with every child in the county regardless of circumstance, something Colt encouraged actively, because he had never forgotten what it felt like to be the child that other children were not supposed to befriend. In 1892, the Mercer Ranch faced the hardest test since the water rights dispute, when a drought that had been building across the southern plains hit with full force, and the creek that fed the spring on the eastern section ran shallow for the first time in Colt's memory. The water rights he had secured in 1879 proved their value in that terrible summer, because he had access to sources that other ranchers did not, and he and Hector managed the grazing rotation with the disciplined precision of men who understand that panic is a resource drain, and they came through with the herd intact, which not every rancher in the county could say. Several smaller operations did not survive the drought. Colt bought 2 of them when the owners made the decision to sell rather than rebuild, transactions he conducted fairly, and at prices he felt reflected the true value of the land rather than the desperation of the moment, which was not the way every buyer in the county operated. One of the men he bought from, a rancher named George Wells, who had been working his section for 8 years and was 74 years old and simply could not face starting over, thanked him with the quiet dignity of a man who has accepted something hard. "You paid me honest," Wells said. "Not everyone would have." "It's the only way I know how to do business," Colt said, and meant it as simply as it sounded. Clara was 43 years old in 1898, and the shop was one of the most successful dressmaking businesses in the region, with a reputation that brought customers from as far as San Antonio for fitted work. She had 2 skilled seamstresses in addition to Polly and Beth, who were now her senior staff, and she had expanded the shop itself 2 years prior, taking over the empty space next door and breaking through the wall to create a proper fitting room and a display area for finished pieces. She also still did her own finest work herself, the commission pieces that required the highest level of skill, because some things you do not delegate if you want them done right. On the 20th anniversary of her arrival in Redemption Creek, in the summer of 1898, she was in the shop sorting a delivery of silk from a supplier in New York, which was a kind of fabric she had not been able to imagine affording when she first arrived, and she found herself thinking about the walk down the main street, the boardwalk and Marable Cott's laughter, and the particular sound of her boot sole flapping against the wood. She thought about it without the sting. It had been 20 years. The sting had gone somewhere that old hurts go when a life has moved so far past them that they become simply part of the geography of how you got here. She closed up the shop at the end of that day and walked home, which meant taking the wagon because 8 miles was too far to walk, and the road out to the ranch was a road she had driven so many times that she knew every turn, and she arrived at the house to find Colt on the veranda with Robert, who was 11 and was apparently explaining something with great enthusiasm while Colt listened with the focused attention he gave to things he found genuinely interesting. And she thought, "This is what I chose. This is what the 30 miles of road and the carpetbag and the borrowed mule were for. And the feeling was not triumph exactly, because triumph implies an opponent, and there had never been an opponent worth naming. It was something quieter. It was a rival. She stepped up onto the veranda and Robert launched himself at her with the full-body energy he applied to greeting people he loved. And she caught him and held him for a moment before he extricated himself because he was 11 and there were limits. And Colt came and kissed her in the easy way of a marriage that is long enough to have found its own language and said, "Good day." "Very good day," she said. "New silk arrived." "Is it the color you wanted?" "Better," she said. He smiled. She sat down in her chair on the veranda and watched the evening come across the land, the long Texas evening that turned everything gold. And Robert went back to whatever he had been telling his father. And the cattle were dark shapes on the far pasture. And somewhere in the house Francis was making the particular sound of someone who is moving furniture with a purpose, which Clara decided to investigate in a moment and not immediately. The boots she had arrived in, the worn ones she had repaired herself, were in a box in the bedroom. She had kept them for 20 years, had moved them with every rearrangement of the house, had refused to discard them when Colt, cleaning out the wardrobe one spring, had asked her about them. "Those stay," she had said. "All right," he had said without asking why, because he understood the kind of thing that stays. They were not a symbol of poverty to her, not anymore. They were a record of what she had been when she arrived here, which was everything necessary and nothing extra. A woman who could sew and think and hold her chin up on a bad street on a bad day and keep walking. They were the beginning of the story, and you do not discard the beginning of a story you are still glad you lived. Thomas came home from the northern range 3 days later, having spent the week riding fence with 2 of the ranch hands, and he was 19 years old, and looked so much like his father at that age that Clara, who had seen photographs of Colt at 20 from a family collection Anna kept, felt the particular pleasant vertigo of time's repetition. He came in and ate everything Rosa put in front of him, because 19-year-old boys who have been riding fence for a week eat everything in front of them. And he reported on the fence conditions and the state of the pasture grass, and a section of ground he thought was worth clearing for expanded grazing. And Colt listened and asked questions, and they talked about the ranch for an hour in the comfortable overlapping way of people who have been talking about the same subject their whole lives. Clara watched them from across the table, her husband and her eldest son, and Francis beside her making sharp, accurate observations about the fence-clearing plan that both of them took seriously without making a show of it, and Robert at the end of the table building something from bread and butter that was almost certainly architectural, and she thought, this is what I built. Not alone and not easily, and not from the beginning with any confidence that it would come to this, but it is here, and it is real, and it is mine. In the early spring of 1899, she made herself a new pair of boots. She had learned enough from the blacksmith and from years of handling leather in repairs to do it properly. Starting from a pattern she made herself from tracing her own foot. She worked on them in the evenings over 3 weeks, the leather work slow and satisfying in the way that making something from the beginning is always satisfying. She lined them with soft calf leather and stitched them with doubled thread and made the soles thick and sound. And when they were finished, she put them on and walked out onto the veranda in the spring evening and stamped her feet gently on the boards to hear the solid sound of them. Colt came out behind her and looked at the boots and then at her. "You made those," he said. "From scratch," she said. He looked at them for a moment longer. "They're beautiful," he said, and he meant the craftsmanship. "I know," she said, and she meant that too, but she also meant something larger, the whole of it. The long road and the 30 miles and the borrowed mule and the laughter and the rawhide knot, and 10 years becoming 20, and the children and the land and the man standing beside her in the spring evening of 1899, with his hat pushed back, and his eyes on her boots and his whole life arranged around the things he loved. She had arrived in Redemption Creek with boots that were trying to say goodbye to her feet. She was leaving nothing behind her now that she had not meant to leave, and in front of her the land stretched all the way to the hills, golden in the afternoon light, familiar and full and entirely hers. Colt put his arm around her shoulders and she leaned into him, and they stood on the veranda of the house they had built together. And the evening came on warm and slow, and from inside the house came the sounds of their children and the smell of Rosa's cooking and the deep constant noise of the cattle, which was the sound of everything being exactly as it should be. 20 years, she said. Not long enough, he said. She turned and looked at him. His face was weathered and familiar, the face she had been looking at for most of her adult life, and it was still the most interesting face she knew. She reached up and put her hand against his jaw briefly, a touch that said everything she would have needed several hundred words to say otherwise, and he covered her hand with his and held it there a moment before she dropped it and turned back to the evening view. Behind them, Francis called something about supper that involved strong opinions, and Robert knocked something over, and Thomas said something sensible about it, and Colt shook his head at all of it with the particular helpless affection of a man surrounded by people he loves who will not stop being themselves for even a moment, and Clara laughed, and the sound of it went out over the veranda into the spring evening and was swallowed by the big Texas sky, and somewhere in the far pasture a single cow raised her head at the sound, and then the evening settled back into itself, warm and complete and whole, the way a life is whole when it has been lived all the way through and found to be, in the end, exactly enough.